From the Yale Center for Faith and Culture, this is For the Life of the World, a podcast about seeking and living a life worthy of our humanity.
Are we dehumanizing because we reduce people to an ideological checklist? I think that is a real problem, again, on both left and right.
This is Luke Bretherton.
And so the reduction, people are complex creatures with multiple loyalties, and their views change over time and are open to change.
He's a theological ethicist that's working at the intersection of religion and democracy.
And do we have a politics which is porous enough to actually account for that and relate to people in that way? Or do we come, in a sense, with a tank and certain kind of positions we've got to hold and then fire off on people if they don't meet our exact positions? And I think they're two very different orientations. One is a genuinely humanizing politics. You don't have to agree with people to not want to kill, coerce, or cause them to flee. If people in the state apparatus, which is killing, coercing, causing to flee, then there probably needs to be some witness against that and treating others in inhuman and dehumanizing ways. Yes, that needs calling out and challenging. How one does that, what that means in practice, that's a matter of practical deliberation.
He's currently the Regius Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology at Oxford, and his most recent book is What is Political Theology?, co-authored with Vincent Lloyd and Valentina Napolitano. And in this episode, he notices a dilemma that's hiding in plain sight, often unconsciously operating in every conversation we're in, every bit of news we read, every sideline interaction, training the social media algorithms that just put it back into your feed, creating an infinite feedback loop that just keeps you in the trenches. But more and more, this tension is becoming more deeply felt. It's rising to the surface. Because increasingly, it seems that a very public and nationalized Christianity is bouncing back as a live, contested question around the world, being put into the service of authoritarianism. And there's a temptation to exist on the extremes of either loyalty to the point of idolatry or total opposition to the point of suspicion of the human beings we need to get along with every day. This creates a dilemma for Christian witness, one that can perhaps only be solved by the courage and fortitude to live in the tension this creates, honoring everyone's dignity and not falling into a gross idolatry of the state.
And so how do we tell a story of grace and disgrace, of ambiguity and irony, but also a story where there are scenes of wonder and stories where there are still open wounds? And that's a very tough story to tell, but it's a story which cut against the shibboleths of both left and right. But I think that's a faithful story, that's a loving story, that's a hopeful story. So I think there's a narrative project, which is an imaginative and theological exercise to understand who we are in relation to Jesus Christ. So that's always, in a sense, the theological task. I think it presses upon us in particular ways when the stakes feel very high for lots of people. If certain stories get told, vast swathes of the population get written off. Nested within that is this very deep challenge of how do you express loyalty without idolatry? How do you tell a story and engage with your political community, locally, regionally, nationally, in a way that both honors and names what needs cherishing and also calls out injustices and refuses the way certain human beings are named as not human and therefore could be treated without regard for their intrinsic dignity in the image of God in them and for whom Christ died. So I think that's a tricky thing. We either have one set of people who are like totally in opposition and another set of people, total loyalty. It's both a theological problem, but it's also a posture and requires a certain moral courage to live in that tensional place. But I think that, again, is a central theological claim about living between the now and the not yet.
In this episode, Ryan McAnnally-Linz welcomed Luke Bretherton onto the show to discuss what's happening as Christianity sees this resurgence in democratic public life and what faithful witness will demand. They reflect on this re-emergence of faith and the theological implications thereof, the apparently real-time collapse of secular progressivism. They discuss democratic agency at the individual and communal level, Augustine on glory and shame, how media monetizes suspicion, why community organizing outlasts protest, and how the church might tell a truer and more costly story about human life together. Thanks for listening.
Hey, Luke. Welcome to For the Life of the World. Thanks for coming on the show.
Great to be with you. Real honor.
So those of us who pay at least a little attention to what's going on over in Europe with respect to kind of the profile of Christianity, the church, have been hearing whispers over recent years of a kind of resurgent public Christianity, both on the continent and in the United Kingdom. And sometimes this will take the form of young people are showing back up in the church, or famous people are showing back up in the church. And I wonder if we could start by you just giving us your sense of what's afoot, whether there's anything real happening that corresponds to these whispers or not.
Yeah, I think there is. It's a very good question. I think there is something real, and I think it's operating at a number of levels. So I think at a kind of very high level, there's a plausibility structure, if you like, of Christianity is kind of back in play, in the what we might call the kind of post-progressive vibe shift, if you like. If we want to coin a term, you heard it here first. But I'm trying to avoid the term post-liberal, so I'm not sure that's quite right. But there's undoubtedly a sense in which the assumptions about a kind of secularization, and the more modern you become, the more secular you become, and the story we might tell about reality under the auspices of a progressive tale about how we move from revelation to reason, from scarcity to abundance, from the sacral realm to the secular realm, from kind of tradition to rationality. This story has come unstuck. It still circulates in the circles of the university I'm at and in certain kind of technocratic elite circles. But for most people, that story is a kind of bankrupt story and doesn't really work anymore. So I think within that context, people are clearly open to different kinds of visions of life, different, certainly more kind of moral language is present in public life, and questions of meaning, purpose, and character are much more on the agenda, or at least can be talked about without being dismissed and the kind of cultural despisers scorning it. And it's like, these are very serious questions. So a good example would be, I sit on this independent commission. It's kind of set up by the government, but independent commission on community and cohesion. And I'm very struck by, I think 10 years ago, we had a very different conversation. So I'm there in kind of various capacities related to my research on kind of democracy, but also, as a religious leader, kind of figure, thinker. But there are many others there who are there in different capacities, but they're some are Sikh, some are Muslim, some are Jewish. People feel very comfortable talking about the importance of their religious commitments and how the role of religion in public life. I just don't think that conversation, in that kind of setting, which is set up to think about government policy, I think it would have been a very different conversation 10 years ago.
This may be tangential, but is there a corresponding kind of rise of what you might call religiosity as a whole in the United Kingdom?
So that's the next level. So I think there's if that's a rather, what I've just described is in a sense a rather opaque, but I think very present change of temperature and scene, if you like. I can put it in very diffuse terms. But I think then there are also in the Bible societies that have been contested research on the quiet revival. But I think there is, along with that shift, the kind of end of the dominance of a certain progressive narrative, we do see young people. We see it here in Oxford. We've got even in the fuddy-duddy, dusty cathedral, we see more young people kind of coming in. But certainly over the road from me is St. Aldate's, which is a kind of charismatic evangelical church, was heaving with people. So there's definitely, I think, evidence of a greater engagement and interest of actual people coming into church. How widespread that is that just young men? Is that more broader? That's hard to tell. But I think there's definitely something going on. I do think the more significant piece is a kind of shift of mood and possibility. Then I think you see, obviously, the political side, and it tends to be the movement of people into churches tends to be read in a more kind of conservative way. I certainly don't think that's true. I think you see a whole range of public intellectuals, whether it's kind of Paul Kingsnorth on one side, coming out of the environmental kind of world, or various other figures on the other side. So I think that there's something definitely happening. How to quantify it, how to specify it. That's that I'm sure that will keep sociologists of religion happy, and in jobs for another 10 years. I should add. So what I didn't say, I said I think in the political discourse there's something interesting there that is connected in, is the use of religion and particularly Christianity as a point of reference. So whether it's, we used to be very anxious and kind of anti-communist crusade, so there's kind of negative sides. So now it's Islam and wokesterism as the enemy for certain strands. But then instead of turning to liberal rationality as the answer, as it would have happened in a previous moment.
Kind of new atheists would have done that.
New atheists would have done that. It's now a Christian civilization discourse, whether that's on the one hand, a kind of story of faded glory, it's all going to hell in a handcart. We used to be great, and now we've kind of lost it through the pollution of wokesters and Muslims, or a kind of story of total shame. The real answer is not capitalism, it's Christianity. It's a story of total shame. It's just, Christianity is just a story of heteropatriarchal, racist hellholism. But it's Christianity is the problem, not some other bugbear you might put in there. Think about Lynn White and the environmental. It's really all why we're in this climate change. It's already all Christianity. That feels like a joke. So it plays out negatively, but also then positively. You might have Tom Holland. You lose liberalism if you let's say have Christianity, or kind of AfD and Geert Wilders and Freedom Party in Austria, and we have a sense of where if we now they're interested. This is a very old version. They're kind of Oswald Spengler wrote this kind of stuff in the 1920s and 30s, and it's kind of back. But it's a kind of anti-Enlightenment thing where we lose these high European values, and this often racially coded of kind of rationality, university, Shakespeare, science, if we lose Christianity. So obviously that's very different from a kind of new atheist thing, which is Christianity is the problem we need to get rid of in order to get to rationality and science. That's why I call it post-progressive. Now we're going to lose Christianity and therefore we're going to become barbarian. But they're not interested in Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. They're very interested in saving liberal rationality in Europe. And Christianity is the crux through which that battle is fought over and against what they see as the forces of barbarism, Islam and wokesterism. So so Christianity and then religion more broadly, whether positively or negatively, and you can read that positive, negative in either way, is interestingly, that's the problem. And then of course, we've play that out around the world. It used to be we fought battles between capitalism and communism. And the reality is, now whether it's Israel-Palestine or whether it's Ruski Mir, the ideology shaping the invasion of Ukraine, or India-Pakistan, or the civil war in Sri Lanka, or, everyone, it's all some version of political theology. It's not the high modern ideologies of communism, socialism, nationalism coming out of the French Revolution, i.e. secular nationalism. It's some variation of whether it's in Islam, Hinduism, Hinduvata, Zionism. It's some version of a political theology. So I think that is it's difficult, it's tricky to disaggregate developments on the ground from a massive shift more broadly and how the world is imagined and narrated. And I think often the story is told of kind of, there are more bums on seats in church. there's, mixed evidence for that. But I think there is definitely something happened anecdotally. I see that, and clergy report that to me, and I see the evidence of it in the churches around me here in Oxford.
Yeah.
But I think you can't disentangle that from a broader discursive shift.
Yeah. And that discursive shift is complex. It sounds like it's not kind of one thing, and it's connected presumably to massive social developments, technological change, all of these sort of things, which is a really complicated situation for Christians to live in. And so my next question would be, how do you think of the task of Christian witness in this kind of sea change type moment?
That's a great question. I think partly it is a narratival one. So just go back to the kind of stories we tell. One has to do the imaginative labor. And I think it's something we see Jesus doing the whole time. We're often handed a script by the culture or the authorities of the day. And too often, I think the church just accepts that script. It doesn't take a pause, I think, what's going on here, and then re-narrate the world back and refuse the terms and conditions of the script it's given. So, as I mentioned before, I think there are two kind of dominant scripts playing out. Either this story of total shame, we've just got to leave behind the past. It's just a hellhole of racism, patriarchy, extractivist capitalism, etc. Quite what the future we're heading into is not clear, but we know we've got to abolish the past. Or it's a story of lost glory. We were once great. We were once civilized. We were once more religious. We once had moral bearings. We once were in community. We once weren't individualistic and atomized. Now we've got to recover a kind of lost glory. And I think that's, that kind of story, of course, was the story that the Romans were telling about themselves when Augustine was writing in 410 with the sack of Rome. We were once great. And look at these, in their day, it wasn't the wokesters and the Muslims who were the problem, it was the Christians. They were the foreign influence that led to the lack of virtue, the abandonment of the gods, and the corruption of our civilization, and had to be kind of punished for it. And Augustine, I think, tells this more complicated story, but he does this extraordinary act of re-narration. And as I think echoing what we see Jesus doing in response to the authorities of his day, which is refusing the terms and conditions that were presented and opening out a different way of imagining the world in the light of Christ. And in Augustine's way of imagining it, it's, well, all political communities are founded on domination. God can be at work through any political community providentially. And so how do we tell a story of grace and disgrace, of ambiguity and irony, but also a story where there are scenes of wonder and stories where there are still open wounds? And that's a very tough story to tell, but it's a story which cut against the shibboleths of both left and right. But I think that's a faithful story, that's a loving story, that's a hopeful story. So I think there's that kind of work, and that work needs to be done in your locality, in your region, in your nation. What story do we tell about Great Britain? What story do we tell about America? So I think there's a narrative project, which is an imaginative and theological exercise to understand who we are in relation to Jesus Christ. So that's always, in a sense, the theological task. I think it presses upon us in particular ways when the stakes feel very high for lots of people. If certain stories get told, vast swathes of the population get written off. So I think that's one challenge. And then I think the other challenge is within that, nested within that, is this very deep challenge of how do you express loyalty to your particular political community, whether it's America or Britain or France or India or wherever, but loyalty without idolatry. How do you tell a story and engage with your political community locally, regionally, nationally, in a way that both honors and names what needs cherishing and also calls out injustices and refuses the way certain human beings are named as not human and therefore could be treated without regard for their intrinsic dignity in the image of God in them and for whom Christ died. So I think that's a tricky thing. We either have one set of people who are like, with totally in opposition, and another set of people, total loyalty. And I think that's a kind of posture problem. It's both a theological problem, but it's also a posture and requires a certain moral courage to live in that tensional place. But I think that, again, is a central theological claim about living between the now and the not yet.
Yeah. Which is, I worry, I guess, something of a discursive disadvantage over simpler stories, right? Because the stories you've just told, Augustine's story is very nuanced and complicated. The way he's relating to the Roman past is ambiguous and ambivalent. And see it kind of in the reception history of Augustine, that there's this kind of constant deviation towards kind of Christian civilization version of it, which you might read as like the kind of pressure towards simplification. And I worry that maybe in our time, one thing we're seeing is like you get simple stories in the everything is and has been awful story, and everything was great and is now awful story. Although it does seem that a lot of people share the sense that something is awful. And I wonder, how do we as Christians kind of speak into that sense in a way that opens up a willingness to listen to a more complicated story?
Yeah, and I think this is where the kind of groundedness of the story, but also crucially of the kind of the witness, he's simplifying and highly polarizing stories which depend on and reproduce a deep suspicion, whether it's a kind of hermeneutics suspicion born out of too many seminars at Yale and Duke, or a kind of conspiracy theory suspicion born out of too long on listening to Joe Rogan, whatever it is, like the kind of the kind of deep suspicion, the immediate reflex way in which people read the world in thinking the worst and assuming bad faith. So and we see that lots of indicators, both in the UK and in America, in terms of breakdown of civic trust at a more national and regional level. Interestingly enough, both in the UK and the US, civic trust, or like civic or social trust, still operates quite well at a local level.
That's interesting.
And I think that speaks to me about the ways in which the part of the challenge, I think, before us, and I think it's a challenge for the church, but I think it's beyond the way that everyone has, is our capacity to, and this I think goes back to a deeply theological commitment to the incarnation and to truth, not as a kind of algorithmic procedure or a rational process. This is the kind of problem with the new atheist, but a lived participative reality. We participate in Christ, who is the ground of all truth and beauty and being. And the question then is, how do we learn and how we form to participate more richly, more profoundly, more hopefully, more lovingly, more hopefully? And I think what we have is we're inside of, to put it in very old, ancient terms, kind of gnostifying systems which want to abstract us from our bodies, treat each other as kind of ones and zeros in an abstract space that, by the way, make billions of dollars for already rich people, and turn us against each other to make more money. So you're right. Those narratives are effective and also weaponized because, and the systems we have kind of reproduce them ad nauseam. And they do that because they do kind of play into, to use Augustine's term, the kind of concupiscence, a certain kind of negative affective register in the human psyche and in the human soul. We want to have enemies. It's easier to organize the world around enemies. It's really hard to organize the world around, love of enemies. And it's hard to make money off love of enemies. So I think we need to be very wise to the kind of political economy of all of this and just call that out for what it is, which is, monetized idolatry. But saying that, I think at a local level, and if we can get people to think with their bodies and inside the act experiential meat-space reality, to use a concrete example, and I now moved to Oxford, but was living in North Carolina for 13 years. And the cul-de-sac, good suburban cul-de-sac I lived in, shout out to American Village. My neighbors are all sorts of different funny folk. And I was the funniest and weirdest of the lot. But I wasn't really worrying about their voting patterns from the guy who very sweetly used to pick up my kids from soccer when I was in a jam, or my wife was in a jam. So, or you have that fantastic stuff. Freezing rain comes down, amazing sort of precipitation I'm now free of here in the kind of dull drizzle of Oxford. So I find myself slightly missing freezing rain, although I cursed it at the time. But freezing rain comes down, and North Carolina being North Carolina, the power always goes out. We had a gas oven, which meant actually we didn't lose power. We could make the soup.
Yeah.
My people in the cul-de-sac are incredibly handy. I'm not very handy. I'm a good academic. I have no idea how to fix anything. They would come and fix things and be brilliant like that. Again, in that moment of care and the reality of our life together, I wasn't checking their voting record. Now, I know they voted all sorts of different ways. Some are aligned, some are not. We would share certain views, not other views. But if I can, the pressure given my social media feeds and Fox News or SNBC or whatever one's kind of media bubble one lives inside of, is to narrate my neighbors in a polarizing friend-enemy script, whether of the left or the right. Mm-hmm. How do I think with my body and of my place-based encounters, and then imagine the world up from there to understand the broader realities from that place, rather than download literally these scripts which are created to make money elsewhere, and then read my local reality through those scripts. So I think the challenge is how can the church genuinely, in a sense, reject these kind of gnostifying forces which atomize and polarize and for very, very venal ends, and actually help people understand the world through their actual experiences, which are more complicated. And the uncle who drives you crazy at Thanksgiving is also the one who turns up with a bake when your child is ill, or there are a million of these kinds of stories. But those stories, which are the actual existential world of people, the extraordinary thing we live in, that those feel fake, and the fake feels real. And that's how idolatry works. It enchants us to see its world as the real world, and the real world as the fake world.
Yeah, the stance of suspicion comes into play, right, in those complicated interactions, by kind of pushing towards a sorting, such that the real or more important thing about the uncle is the political views that you find abhorrent, which, when aggregated with millions of other people, have actual real consequences in the world, right? And it can be, I think there's a tempting narrative to tell oneself that the kind of the truthful and good thing to do is to look at that aggregate and to say, well, like, I mean, it's nice that somebody's nice to me, but like some people who Jesus would have me call my neighbors, several cities away, are currently being kind of violently repressed or something like that, right? What would your pitch be for stay in stay in the local? And how does that? Is there a way to bootstrap that locality towards hope for the broader?
Right. Yeah. So I think a couple of things on that. I mean, the first is to say, it's true. You might genuinely be some of your uncle's views are abhorrent. That can be an absolutely true statement. It can also be a true statement that, does that tell you everything there is to know about your uncle? And so are we dehumanizing because we reduce people to an ideological checklist? I think that is a real problem, again, on both left and right. And so the reduction of people are complex creatures with multiple loyalties, and views change over time, and are open to change. And do we have a politics which is porous enough to actually account for that and relate to people in that way? Or do we come in a sense, with a tank and certain kind of positions we've got to hold, and then fire off on people if they don't meet our exact positions. And I think they're two very different orientations. One is a genuinely humanizing politics. You don't have to agree with people to not want to kill, coerce, or cause them to flee. You can just think it's probably a bad idea to kill, coerce, and cause them to flee. So if the uncle is in some state of the state apparatus, which is killing, coercing, causing to flee, then there probably needs to be some witness against that, and treating others in inhuman and dehumanizing ways. Yes, that needs calling out and challenging. How one does that, what that means in practice, that's a matter of practical deliberation. Now, I think in terms of the movement from the local, I think, again, there's a kind of long history to tell. I blame the discovery of the mailing list, mass mailing in about 1950. But the shift whereby, if you think in the 19th century, we had a kind of moment of institutional genius. And whether it's trade unions, whether it's denominations, whether it's scouts and guides, women's institutes in this country, guilds, I'm just thinking about kind of institutional life in this country, but there are many equivalents, Rotary clubs. What you had actually was local bodies, which would then confederate to regional bodies, which would then confederate to national bodies. And what that did was there was a kind of mycelial life of identification, belonging, and conversation between the very local and the national. And then basically someone discovered mass mailing, and you could sit in an office in DC, talk to some politicians, and you didn't have to sustain those trust building, that social ecology, which renewed the worlds of trust, relationship, and belonging, and the ways those then interconnected. All you needed to do was send out a mass mailing and treat all the people at the other end who used to meet together and talk together as a campaign for whatever it was, whether it's a Democratic Party or the Rotary Club or whatever. Now, some people kept that, and churches for a while kept that. And then we moved to mega churches, and we're no longer at the kind of local, regional, as in the classic mainline denominational structure. So I think that is, if we take that imaginary and think about a kind of trans-localism and a confederalism, where you move between localities and across localities and then federate. And that's a much thicker form of association. And I think part of our problem is we are vulnerable, and this is a point made in the 20s and 30s through to the 40s, the problem of the mass society, lots to do with the crowd. There's lots of writing in sociology in the 30s on this. But how do you move from a mass or a crowd, which is a bunch of individuals who are atomized and don't have thick of relationships between themselves, and therefore can easily be manipulated? They have no intentionality and connection where they can come together and say, I just read this thing on social media. Is that true? If all you are the only thing that connects you is social media, you are very vulnerable to manipulation and to the top-down kind of mobilization. Again, whether on the left or on the right. If you are forming thicker forms of association, and then those forms of association can organize together, this kind of anticipates perhaps the community organizing stuff we'll get into later, then actually you're much more resilient and resistant to that kind of manipulative. The movement from a mass or a crowd to a people or a demos is always the challenge. But of course, that was Moses' challenge. How do you take a bunch of people who were disaggregated, atomized, didn't have a sense of connection, fearful, very prone to suspicion, both of each other and of the outside enemy, and move them to being a covenantal people, able to relate and connect together, defend their own interests, and actually work together and treat each other justly and generously. And that's always the challenge. And I think that's the challenge of the church. It's the challenge, any political challenge. We're just under particular material social conditions, which exacerbate that perennial challenge.
Right. And technological conditions in particular, where there's the kind of paradox of mediation, which is that technological mediation, mass mediation undercuts these more social confederative forms of mediation. There has been a kind of striking rise of the figure of the strong man globally, and the promise of unmediated belonging. Right. Like what one thing that the authoritarian figure does is promise direct connection to power and belonging that doesn't require the messy kind of tangledness of that local stuff. And now I think it would just underscore your point, right? That, and again, the technology feeds into that because you can sign up for your favorite figure's feed on X or whatever, right?
Yeah, I mean, two things on that. I think one on the mediation, one on the strongman. I think on the mediation point, I think that's exactly right. However, and this is a kind of broader philosophy of technology question of adherences and affordances and that kind of stuff. I think we need a more granular sense of the different possibilities of different media forms. So WhatsApp is not the same form as TikTok.
Right. Yep.
Now, I think there are questions about AI and blockchain, but to use an example, cryptocurrency is very explicitly built off a hyper-individualistic libertarian frame of reference, so there is no loyalty to the nation in a kind of cryptocurrency frame.
Right.
It's meant to aid. If America goes down, you just move all your crypto over to a server in Singapore. If that goes down, you move it over to wherever. So it's built. There's no loyalty to people or place, and money is then instantly movable and totally unindividual. And it's that kind of Lockean possessive individualism is operating in that. And I think it's ironic that this is being promoted by people who kind of want to hold up ethno-nationalist frames of reference when it absolutely represents the opposite of that. Now, I think you could take blockchain and there's some really interesting experiments on this. There's one in Durham, North Carolina, where I used to live, of building on the model of Korean lending circles. Because of the transparency, you can create peer-to-peer lending networks in locality, particularly in poor communities, particularly in African American communities with historic redlining, and create and ensure capital, people, and place stay connected. So there's allows for investment in that place. Now that's a pro-social, pro-democratic engineering project, which has a fundamentally different imaginary and understands and rethinks fintech through the lens of its social impact. No one's going to get that's still wealth creation, still generating kind of investment and that kind of stuff, but it's a radically different vision than if
it's wealth creation that doesn't move directly to wealth concentration.
Yes, it doesn't concentrate power. And I think then that relates to the strongman point. What I think the genius of that kind of re-engineering blockchain through a pro-social lens, and I think we could take all technologies and reimagine them through that frame of a kind of pro-social, pro-democratic, agency-centric and relational frame. But if you think about the strongman, we are, and going all the way back to where we began with the different stories we tell, we are going through a period of seismic change. We've changed our relationship to nature, think about climate change, what it means to be a man or woman, questions about gender, how are we going to work, think about the impact of AI, how are we talking to each other and communicating about social media. Every single thing is intensely changing. Family patterns, work patterns, how we do politics, etc. Now, we lived through a parallel period of that through the 19th, early 20th century. And there were only two responses, and this is kind of Karl Polanyi's thesis in The Great Transformation. There are only two responses. One is you want order. The world is disordered. So how do you get order? You can either give over responsibility to the strong man or to the party or and that's the kind of fascism, communism, to a kind of vanguardist group or the strong man or whatever. And they promise order and that's what you get. Or there's the democratic option, which is you come together. And that was the trade union movement. You could see that in the environmental movement, whereas others, but classically in the trade union movement. And you come together and build shared relational power and relational agency through taking responsibility for each other. And those really are the only options. And we see both today. But theologically understood, the giving over of responsibility, and you can hear kind of Barth and Bonhoeffer and others in the background here, the giving up of responsibility, the giving over and then the giving up of responsibility is itself an act of self-dehumanizing. It actually is a refusal of our vocation to stand as those responsible before God and each other in kind of Barthian terms. But then crucially, in we can think here in more personalist terms, whether Maritime, Catholic social teaching, others, if I can't be human, I can't be fully realized the image of God in me outside of relationship with you, and I have to be able to contribute to some shared world of meaning and action for me to fulfill my personhood, to move from merely being human to being fully realizing who I am as a person before God and before you, then how am I able to contribute to shared worlds of meaning and action and both receive from and give to in a kind of contributory and participative way? So that's a relational anthropology connected to a participative account of truth and the sense of becoming human through relationship with and for others. And that's the only way I can realize who I am as a person. The giving up and giving over responsibility not only dehumanizes myself, but it creates material and social conditions in which it's harder and harder for everyone else to realize who they are as persons. So there's a structural dynamic is quickly in play there. And again, that's what we're seeing around us today. And so I think that sense in which both the kind of redesign of our material social conditions and then how that is the context of certain political conditions and how that altogether is the context in which is it the case that each and every person is able to contribute to and receive from and act in the world around them. And that's where I think the real crisis of our time lies, the crisis of agency. And people don't feel they have agency, but instead of coming together in forms of broad-based democratic movements in which you take kind of shared responsibility for the world and therein realize your own agency through democratic means, you give over responsibility to the strong man, or I would argue on the left, to some rather brittle ideology that can't deal with the realities of life and then becomes a kind of hammer to beat everyone up with. So that living in the kind of weeds of actually how we humans relate and therefore discover our agency, discover our capacity to be who we are, have a sense of who we are in relation to others. That is a messy, but that's also where the energy is, where the life is. That's where the creativity is. And I think that is part of the challenge before us.
So I'm thinking a little bit about the U.S. context and where, if anywhere, we see things that might be candidates for broad-based democratic movements, participatory things. And so two things come to mind, and I wonder kind of if they indicate different kinds of phenomena for you. So one is mass protest.
Mm-hmm.
So the last decade has seen more of that in the United States than certainly the 80s, 90s, and aughts did. And there certainly is a sense of belonging, of participating in something big and meaningful. At the same time, if you were to say, what have been the longer term effects of movements of mass protest in the United States in the last decade or so, it's not clear to me that there have been big, that they've achieved their ends, right?
Yeah.
And then, so recently, you'll be aware of roughly what's happening in Minneapolis, which the response of a good portion of the citizenry there has been oftentimes talked about as protest, but takes a mostly a rather different form, which looks like a kind of neighborhood-based action, walking kids to school, things of that sort. And I've heard it described as better classified as organizing than protest.
Right.
I know that some of your earlier work was on community organizing and kind of its relation to Christianity's relation to it and vice versa.
Yeah.
I don't expect you to be able to comment on Minneapolis, right? You're not there. You haven't studied it or anything like that. But I wonder if there is a meaningful distinction between kind of modern mass protest movements and organizing, and what that distinction is and why it matters for Christian life.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think so. There is a classic distinction in community organizing circles between mobilizing and organizing. So mobilizing is what we might call the kind of the mass march. You mobilize people, they turn out on the street, but actually the relations between them are very thin around a single issue. When the issue goes away, that people dissipate, and so that you generate a crowd, and that crowd then marches and protests. It's often unclear whether that mass mobilizing is linked into any broader transformatory political program effort. So the contrast here would be civil rights movement as the kind of classic kind of paradigm of where organizing and mobilizing. So the March on Washington is a kind of instance of mobilizing, mass mobilize people together. But it's also got dense, thick, decades-long forms of organizing connected into it. And so these two things have tended to come unstuck. So you have one set of people doing mobilizing and another set of people doing organizing. Over the past decade, particularly since kind of Black Lives Matter 1, there's been a lot of thinking about, well, this doesn't work. And then I think particularly in the wake of the failures of the Arab Spring, where you saw again mass mobilizing, and then it was completely, mostly, I think Morocco would be the exception, was overturned by small elites or juntas or dictators getting into power. And there was a lot of soul searching after that, but what was actually achieved? Can you do anything with mass mobilization? Now, I think David Graeber died a few years ago now, the anthropologist, has this book called Direct Action. It's kind of ethnography of mostly forms of anarchist groups. I think he makes a good point in that about even in the march, in the mass mobilizing march, there is a certain discovery of agency. The chant goes up, you have a sense of your capacity to act in a world in which it's constantly, if you're working in the call center, if you're just subject to social media feeds or whatever, you feel a passive consumer of decisions elsewhere or content made elsewhere. So the physical act of coming out together, there is a certain realization. I don't want to diminish that, but I do think, and drawing on the kind of work of people like Ella Baker and others, unless that's connected into more localist organizing efforts, it's always going to be a kind of flash in the pan, and then can often set up terrible cycles of, you feel like, well, there were a million. We saw the absolute classic version of this was which is going back a long time now, but the largest single march in human history was the anti-Iraq war march. So this is a long time ago now, and it led to nothing. Nothing did, and that. Again, that was one of those moments a lot of people went, well, hang on a sec. Like, how can it be that we had millions and millions and millions of people out on the street, but nothing changed? The Women's March would be another one more recently. But so I think the ways in which organizing and mobilizing can go together is key. Now, why does it matter for Christian life? I think it matters because it goes back to this question of agency and what it means to be made in the image of God, and to how do we both realize our own personhood with and through others, and also create material and social conditions in which all people, regardless of situation or station or whatever they're like, are able to realize their agency with others. And I think that's where organizing is very key, because it is this more localist form. And it's often critiqued. Manuel Castells had this critique about 20 years ago of organizing. It's too localistic. There's a kind of familiar critique of organizing. It doesn't scale, because scale is the only thing that matters. Or it's not. That was back in the days of globalization, and when that was the thing, no longer a thing. But I think always misses the point. It's not about scale, because that is the metric of effectiveness and efficiency. which is back in the old progressive story to be told. What really matters is rational administration, effectiveness, efficiency. As we know, actually, you can be very effective and efficient, and it's unbelievably dehumanizing. The Nazis were very effective and efficient. It doesn't make it good. The meaning, purpose, character questions has to be in play. And in organizing, the issues are important, and you need to win some battles. But the crucial thing, it's about leadership development and the development of people. And so just to use one story, when I was organizing in London 20 years ago now, but I remember one particular, there's a global chain of kind of, they produce malls in American terms, but it's called Westfield. They've got two very big ones in London. I'm not sure they're in America. And in West London, where I live, Shepherd's Bush, there's a derelict bit of land. I grew up in that area, derelict for most of my life. And they were planning a Westfield. And there was a block of social housing that overlooked it. Very tragically, recently, one of them got burned down. The Grenfell fire was there.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Block was that area. And there was this young girl, she was mid-teens from a local Catholic school. And we were at a community organizing meeting. And she said, well, what are you all going to do about Westfield? And none of us really thought about it. We learned oh, crikey, what are we going to do about it? Well, anyway, that instituted this kind of conversation and campaign. And about 5 years later, I remember sitting in a assembly of West London citizens. And we had the kind of global director of Westfield on the stage. And there was this, now she was at university, kind of young woman, pinning this global director of Westfield about how were they going to have living wage jobs, apprenticeship, and how they can contribute to the schools. And rather than this kind of extractive spaceship landing and sucking wealth out, how was it going to contribute to the people and welfare of that place? And it was amazing. And I thought, that process of seeing her discover her agency and leadership and capacity. Now, we did actually have some amazing wins with Westfield, but that really wasn't the point. That wasn't the main thing. It was that a group of people who didn't think they could act in the world discover their leadership and their potential, and in very real ways, not in a kind of anodyne, I'm going to use a terrible slur, kind of Chick-fil-A leadership academy type way, which doesn't really connect. Like it was actually real things happened in the world that were existentially important for a lot of people. And so that she then still lives in the area. She can walk around like, I changed this world. Like that's an amazing, that's an extraordinary feeling, and a very real way in which she is then able to realize her personhood in and through others and have a sense of agency in the world. And I think that's organizing. The campaigns and issues and the wins are important, but they're not as important as it's primarily, and this is Saul Alinsky, going all the way back to Saul Alinsky, is very clear on this in his writing. It's first and foremost about the people. And so often, and I think this is another contrast with mobilizing, and where I think it can be very problematic, is it's too often actually about the program, and then the people are simply campaigning for.
People are means, yeah.
And it says instrumentalizing, and it quickly burns people out because they have that slight high of the march, nothing happens, and then they kind of get burnt out and depressed and like, well, I can't. So it diminishes their sense of agency because it's a kind of sugar rush agency, can be, unless it's tied into richer patterns of organizing. Organizing is a kind of thick, it's like a meat and two veg kind of agency. That's I'll make a vegan casserole kind of agency. It's this far more resilient, sustaining, and nourishing, I think, over the long term, and therefore thickening of the social fabric. And that's the primary metric. But it's because it's in kind of foundation world, which wants to measure everything in kind of quantitative terms, qualitative differences are very hard to grasp, and so somehow don't count as real. And yet we all know the difference between an area with thick trust and an area of thin trust.
Well, Luke, thank you so much for the conversation. It's been great talking with you, and hope to do it again.
Indeed. Really great to be with you. Thank you.
For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture at Yale Divinity School. This episode featured Luke Bretherton, interview by Ryan McAnnally-Linz, production assistance by Noah Sentill. I'm Evan Rosa, and I edit and produce the show. For more information, visit us online at faith.yale.edu and lifeworthliving.yale.edu. On both of these websites, you can find a variety of resources to help people envision and pursue lives that are worthy of our humanity. If you're new to our show, remember to hit subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you don't miss our next episode. And if you've been listening for a while, please consider this request. Share one of your favorite episodes. Maybe it's this one, maybe it's another recent one. Bring it up in your next conversation. Tell your family and your friends. Post it online. Every little share helps, not just to grow the show, but to embody its mission, which is to pursue a life that's worth living together. Thanks for listening, friends. We'll be back with more soon.